Welcome to A Healthy Curiosity, the podcast that explores what it takes to be well in a busy world. With self-care strategies from Chinese medicine, functional medicine, Ayurveda, neuroscience, and beyond. I'm your host, Brody Welch, a licensed acupuncturist and transformation catalyst, here to support you on your journey of health, happiness, and personal evolution. Welcome to today's show. Chinese medicine practitioners who do any kind of internal medicine tend to be pretty obsessed with digestion. If you've ever been to an acupuncturist, you're familiar with this. We're always curious about what's going on in your gut. We want the gory details of what your poop looks like, whether or not you deal with gas, bloating, low or excessive appetite, bad breath, nausea, irritable bowels, you name it. We can be kind of obsessed with the digestive system, which we consider governed primarily by the spleen and stomach organ systems that are central to the production of qi and blood, which is basically what we need to have energy to do life with and the power to execute literally all the functions that our body is supposed to do. And it's unfortunately way too common that people have been living with digestive issues for years or even decades and either ignoring it or maybe worse, popping Tums or Smooth Move tea on a regular basis and think it's not really that big a deal. But if you're not digesting well, you're not absorbing everything that you need to be healthy. I also see so many health conscious people who think they're eating well. They're spending all sorts of money on complicated protein powders and smoothies and gluten-free bread and processed fake meat and kale salads that are raw. And from a Chinese medicine perspective, these are often a digestive nightmare, making all these sorts of things worse. Simply put, we can't use what we can't digest. And what we can't digest causes problems, not just in our GI tract, but also leading to feeling tired or sluggish, mood disorders like anxiety or depression, sleep issues, brain fog, postnasal drip, increased susceptibility to yeast infections, bladder infections, viral infections, difficulty with making decisions, chronic pain, osteoporosis, autoimmune disease, hormone imbalance. The list goes on and on because all systems of the body affect one another. With me to unpack how the digestive system works and its central role in supporting us and all the functions in our body is Dr. Darlene Easton. Dr. Easton earns a master's in nutrition and a doctorate in acupuncture and Chinese medicine. She has 20 years in higher education. She's taught all aspects of traditional Chinese medicine, including dietary therapy and nutrition. She was an associate professor at New York College of Health Professions from 1999 to 2003. And she is now in private practice offering health and nutritional counseling while she continues to teach online to professionals around the world. Dr. Darlene Easton, thank you so much for joining me today on A Healthy Curiosity. I'm so excited to talk to you today.
So excited to be here. Thanks, Brody, for having me.
Why do you think acupuncturists are so obsessed with digestion and that this is becoming true, I think, more of functional medicine doctors as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone should be obsessed with digestion. And in particular, certainly as acupuncturists and doctors of Chinese medicine, we learn early on in our curriculum that the organs of digestion, you mentioned the spleen, stomach. I would broaden that out a little bit to include spleen, stomach, the intestines, the liver, gallbladder, but all of those organs of digestion are essentially the pivot or the central aspect of our body physically and of our health. Certainly, you mentioned very eloquently that we can't use what we can't digest. And so really, as human beings, we are always interacting with our environment, whether it's the air we breathe, the water we drink, and certainly the foods that we eat.
Absolutely. It's so central and yet seemingly so confusing to people. There's all sorts of conflicting information about what we should be eating. I'd love to know what you think about that. What would you love to see people do differently to improve their microbiome and their digestive health?
Well, okay, so you just threw another term in there that I think would be worth mentioning, and that is the microbiome. So for anyone listening who, I don't know, who's not familiar with it at this point, but just to briefly define, the microbiome And when we're speaking about the gut and digestion, refers to this milieu of microorganisms that live within primarily in our intestines, primarily in the large intestine, but they definitely are also at the more distal aspect of the small intestine. These organisms play a central role in our immunity and our digestive function. They secrete enzymes. They train our immune system. They transform vitamins into usable substances. So at this point, actually, the microbiome is considered to be an organ unto itself. I think the last I've heard from the experts is it weighs in anywhere between 3 and 4 pounds. So it's obviously, it's not one microorganism that weighs that much. It's the culmination of all the organisms, which, by the way, it's not just accounting for bacteria. These are also fungi and types of helminths, viruses, and all sorts of organisms, primarily bacteria, though.
I love that it's finally getting the credit that it's due as an organ, because it's not necessarily, well, it's obviously thinking of ourselves as an ecosystem is not something that most of us grew up thinking about, right? The body as a machine is usually the model. And in Chinese medicine, of course, we see the body more as this living ecosystem where all parts work together. And even like with the microbiome, we have a nasopharyngeal microbiome, and we have a urogenital microbiome, but the one in the gut that we're talking about today is as so central, kind of like links it all together. And so, yeah, so thank you for unpacking the definition of what the microbiome is and why we should bother helping it out. What are the things that you'd like to see people do to help their microbiome?
Okay, so yeah, I would start by saying, let's remember that we are interacting with the world and the environment. We should consider, just to shift our perspective a little bit from understanding our place in this world. And our place really is as a living organism. I think, if you don't mind indulging me in just a little bit, I would like to just speak about, how far removed so many of us have become. I see this in my clinical practice. Maybe you see it in yours as well. People forget that we are actually human organisms. They come in recently, now that the weather is changing, at least here on the East Coast, and they say, gosh, I feel so tired lately. I want to go to bed earlier. I don't understand what's happening. And I have to remind them that, well, we're actually moving into fall now. And so this is the time where your circadian rhythm is going to change. Your hormones change. Things change. You are responding to nature. So in that sense, I would say, let's remember that we are human organisms, and what we put in our mouth needs to be natural. So another way of saying that is whole foods only, please.
Oh, it's so, I love both of those points that you just made. Yes, the fact that we are part of nature, we are connected to the natural world, and acknowledging that allows us to, I think, recognize that, I mean, the pulsation of life between yin and yang, being in sync with that throughout the year. Yeah, this is the time of year in the Northern Hemisphere, right? We're moving into fall, that everything, it's, yes, more rest, more quiet, more alone time, a little bit more sleep. I consider sleep sacred right now. It's part of, supporting the immune system, which of course is the lungs and large intestine that play a vital role in keeping us from getting sick, from getting outside influences coming in where they don't belong. So important. And just eating with the seasons, eating the things that nature is providing us. Nature's going in. It's putting all the nourishment on the ground or under the ground right now, the squashes and the root vegetables. And so a lot of times it's like, it doesn't have to be so mysterious if we consider ourselves part of nature.
Absolutely. And to your point, just going back to the microorganism, I'm sorry I'm taking us on kind of a roller coaster here, but we'll come back to start.
Sure. Yeah.
What roller coasters do, but we're going to go upside down first. And that is to remember that the microbiome, which is part of our gut system, from a Chinese medicine perspective, I've taught for a long time, actually 20 years. I then moved from downstate, where I taught at the college, to upstate to develop a program at the New York Chiropractic College's Finger Lakes School of Acupuncture and Oriental Medicine. So I've been teaching for a long time. And when I say that, I mean, my nose has been in the books, right, for a long time, and trying to understand what it is that our lineage of wonderful medicine is trying to tell us. And this idea of the middle jiao, spleen, stomach, intestines, as being the focal point for, as you said earlier, the production of qi and blood. And really, what does that mean? And if we think about qi as having these 5 primary functions to protect and defend us, to activate and keep things moving, to contain and hold things in place, to warm and to transform, when we look at the role of the gut, in particular the role of the microbiome, we can see all of that happening. So my thinking is that what these ancients were talking about certainly did include the microbiome, for sure. Didn't really know that's what they were talking about because it's microscopic, but we can see that with all of the functions that we now understand as being related to the microbiome. We can certainly understand that is a big part of how we as Chinese medicine practitioners see the middle jiao.
Absolutely. You mentioned the liver and the intestines as also really important to consider. What can we do for our liver that maybe we're not doing on a regular basis?
Well, our livers are taking a beating, aren't they? Our livers are an organ of detoxification. Our organs are also the place where excess glucose gets packed up as glycogen. Our liver is the only place where fructose can get metabolized and packed up. So if you think about the role of the liver and then all the things, the modern things that are being put upon it at this time, it's got a huge job. You think about all of your female patients who are on birth control pills. That has to be dealt with through the liver. Think about all of the fructose and sugar people are eating. A lot of it is because anxiety. People, use sugar to calm themselves down. Think about all the processed foods. Think about all the environmental toxins, all the glyphosates, all the sprays. This is all put on our liver. So, in fact, I think we always have to pay attention to the health of our liver. And that really would be making sure we're incorporating foods like young leafy greens, shoots, sprouts are one of the best things we can do for our liver. And in particular, I have my patients, I strongly encourage them to grow their own. People get a little freaked out about listeria contamination because there have been times of recall for sprouts. They're very easy to grow in a mason jar. I encourage them to there are blends, organic of course, that have broccoli sprout within it. And broccoli sprouts are actually really high in sulforaphane, which our liver loves, helps us detoxify, more so than broccoli itself. The sprouts are super high. If we want to use broccoli, people who like broccoli, make sure if you can afford, it's organic. And don't throw the stems away, rather peel them. You lop off the very end where it's super tough and fibrous that you can't eat, but you just peel away the outer edge and then slice up that nice stem, which, by the way, is much higher in sulforaphane than the actual florets. So foods like that, cruciferous vegetables, very important to detoxify estrogen metabolites. So any of our female patients or listeners who are taking birth control pills, for example, should be eating plenty of cruciferous vegetables. That's your broccoli, your cabbages, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, bok choy, these types of things. And of course, as I mentioned before, sprouts.
I think that's such an important point. It's that yes, our livers are working overtime with all the chemicals in our environment and also the things that we're putting into our body on purpose, right? Like birth control pills and other drugs that certainly can take their toll on the liver. PMS, right? That's something that that I've seen clear up when people, I mean, a lot of times that's the estrogen is relatively too high relative to progesterone, and that people adding broccoli sprouts to their life can notice a massive difference pretty
Yeah.
quickly. It's very cool. How much are we talking about when you say when people are like, "Oh yeah, I eat those things," but are you talking about like every day in a particular amount?
Every person is different and the needs of everybody's body is different, but these things have to be part of our regular diet. So, what does that mean exactly? Hard to say. I mean, I think that having a handful of sprouts at least 5 days out of 7 would be nice to incorporate. That's not all. I would say to incorporate a cruciferous vegetable or two at least 5, 6 days out of the week. Yeah, I think it has to be part of our daily life.
Awesome. Thanks. I really appreciate not only that, like what you have to say, but how practical I've heard you make a lot of your information. And so I'm hoping that people can come away from this conversation with some inspiration to do things differently. I'd like to turn us towards some common issues that people might be struggling with and maybe provide instead of the conventional medicine option of like taken over the counter medication in order to handle the symptom, but maybe instead what we could be doing from Chinese medicine lens to
Mhm.
prevent these symptoms from arising or even to treat them. So just starting at the top of the digestive tract, maybe
Are you
not the
pitching balls at me now, Brody? This sounds good. I'm like, okay, I got my catcher's mitt on. Like, go
all
ahead.
right, awesome. Okay, let's take acid reflux, right? This is
Oh,
something this is something that I was just talking to somebody the other day who was concerned about osteoporosis, and yet
oh,
she'd been taking Tums and she had been put on, despite a family history, and despite, well, that she had been put on proton pump inhibitors for years, and obviously that's going to decrease our capacity to get minerals into our bones, right? To absorb that. And so clearly it's taking things that kill our stomach acid on a regular basis certainly can cause other problems too. But I'd love your take on kind of like, is it that big a deal? What's the problem here, and what might be a better solution?
gosh, where do I start? Yeah. This is a big one. I love this topic and it impassions me to speak about it because it is so prevalent. If there was ever a drug that is being abused, it has to be omeprazole, right? These proton pump inhibitors. And the commercials drive me bonkers. I want to throw things at my television set when I see, somebody running around with a giant spare rib, hitting him on the head, and he turns around and takes some sort of purple pill and says, "Okay, now I can take you on," right?
Right. Yep.
That's
Go on.
okay. So is it okay if I just spend a couple of moments just to
Please. Yeah. Yeah. It does not have to be an encyclopedic answer, but we also, listeners of the show, I think are pretty sophisticated and like the deeper dives. So go for it.
excellent. Okay. So let's first start out with the understanding that our stomachs should be or have a pH level of approximately zero point 0.5 to 1.5. That is like car battery acid. If we took the contents of your stomach and put it on your car, the paint should come off. Otherwise, something is wrong. Most people do not have hyperacidity. That is a rare condition, actually. For most people who are experiencing some discomfort after they eat, it is for other reasons. Much of the time, it's because their digestive function, including their digestive enzymes, including the acid that the stomach produces, is not sufficient enough. Now, that may sound counterintuitive because you think, well, what are you saying? If I don't have enough stomach acid, or if I don't have enough digestive enzymes, why do I feel burning? And there are reasons for that. One of the reasons is that, and just let me pause for one moment to differentiate. Hydrochloric acid, which is stomach acid, is secreted in the stomach. When we see food, when we think of food, when we smell food, our brain sends a signal and a hormone called gastrin to our stomach and instructs the cells in our stomach to begin releasing hydrochloric acid in preparation. It's priming the pump for food. Once we start eating, other secretions happen. Those are called digestive enzymes. They come from the small intestine, they come from our pancreas, and also the gallbladder releases bile, which is very, very important for digestion. And if we put a pin in bile, I'd love to come back to it for other reasons.
Done.
But bile acts like a detergent. And not only does bile break down fat, but it's also antimicrobial. So it's very important. Now, all of these things together will be breaking down food. The food is broken down in the stomach by hydrochloric acid and some other protein enzymes. Then it starts moving downward into the small intestine where more things happen, more enzymes come in. If there is insufficient stomach acid, meaning if the pH is not right, that sphincter, when you swallow from your esophagus into your stomach, it's called the lower esophageal sphincter. That sphincter is regulated by how acidic your stomach is. If it's acidic enough, the sphincter can close properly. If the stomach is not acidic enough, it does not properly close, and it's kind of floppy, and it can allow for backflow. Isn't that interesting?
Well, it makes so much sense that you have this car battery acid in the form of HCl, and it belongs in the stomach. But if it doesn't stay there, it's like just like our if you have a gas stove, yeah, we're supposed to have a fire there. But if you have a fire in the rest of your kitchen, it's a big problem. It's like
you've got issues. That's right.
So yeah, the fact that it's HCl where it doesn't belong, where our esophagus is not designed to handle it, and so yeah, that's a lot of times what people deal with. I believe I've heard the statistic that 80% of people with acid reflux actually have lower acidity rather than high acidity.
And I would guess it's even higher than that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Really good to know. And so clearly, if that's not the problem, then continuing to lower the acidity, why does that help? People are like, well, I take this and it makes it better.
Right. So there are two reasons for that come to my mind. There may be more reasons, but I'm going to express two right now. Okay. So one of the reasons is because if there's not enough acid and the food is not broken down properly, then it can actually start to ferment, right? And it can start to grow bacteria that obviously shouldn't be there. As a result, you can have this gaseous upflow. So that's one reason, because things that ferment, think about a compost pile, right? Yep. You can actually see the waves of heat coming off the compost pile because it's fermenting. So that's one reason. The other reason, and this is, I think, fascinating, again, speaks to this yin and yang balance of the body, is that the stomach acid, the right pH in the stomach will actually trigger the goblet cells in the stomach to produce mucin, which becomes part of that protective mucilaginous coating in the stomach. If we don't have sufficient coating, mucus coating in the stomach, our stomach would eat itself. It would dissolve itself with the acid, right? So sometimes if the mucus is not well formed, and that can be in the esophagus as well, because there's no response to forming it because of the low acidity, you can actually have a thinning of the lining. And then even if you eat something like a lemonade or an orange or a little apple cider vinegar, which is wonderful for us, just the acidity of the food itself, because the lining is thin, can be bothersome. It's like if you walk barefoot on hot sand, then even if you're on a nice plushy carpet barefoot, that can be irritating. You see what I mean?
Absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense. It's a great description. And so people are kind of continuing in this cycle of they have low acidity, they're taking medication that's making it even lower, they're feeling better, so they think it's helping. But from what you've just said, it could be perpetuating a vicious cycle.
Absolutely.
What's a
And
better yeah.
can I just mention that something you said earlier about your patient who came in concerned about osteoporosis, right?
Yeah.
So we know that using these proton pump inhibitors actually leaches or damages the bone. One thing I want to mention, again, if you say, people are listening, they understand that the bone should be breaking itself down and building itself up, right? This is a human thing. We break down, we build up. We break down, we build up. But one of the things that I didn't actually know until fairly recently is that the two opposing types of cells in the bones, one is called an osteoclast, one is called an osteoblast. The breakdown cell is called an osteoclast. That is actually part of our immune system. It's actually an immunological cell. It's a type of lymphocyte. And in the presence of inflammation, it activates and can break down the bone faster. And what does a low pH in our stomach do? It can start causing inflammation because things grow where they shouldn't. We have gram-negative bacteria that can start thriving in the intestines and produce lipopolysaccharides, which are endogenous toxins, and set off a whole trigger of systemic inflammation. So the stone we drop in the pond the ripples go very far and wide.
A Healthy Curiosity turned 5 years old in July 2021, and I want to express some heartfelt gratitude for you, for listening, for sharing the show, for your ratings and reviews, and for being a fellow giver who cares about your health and personal evolution. This show would not exist without you. To celebrate, I've put out a virtual tip jar. If this show has inspired you, encouraged you, or taught you something over the past 5 years, you're invited to leave me a tip. Head to the show notes and click on the link to the tip jar, or head to brodywelch.com/product/tip jar, all one word. Your gratitude made visible will totally make my day. Now back to the show. That also makes a lot of sense, that the HCl is there to, in part, to kill off the bacteria that don't belong in our bodies. And so if it's too weak to do that, then they creep in, they take up residence, and then they hide, and they're hard to get rid of. So what does Chinese medicine have to say? Like, what's our answer to that?
One of the basic tenets of Chinese medicine, and we all remember learning this in fundamental theory 1, is always protect the spleen stomach. We always have to guard against damage to our spleen stomach. And what does that mean in modern times? Well, that means if the digestion is weak, the person eats, they've got a lot of belching, a lot of flatulence, they feel full, uncomfortable. It is not time to be taking Tums and over-the-counter acid blockers or running to your doctor for a proton pump inhibitor. It's actually a time to say, okay, let's take stock. What am I eating? How much am I eating? Am I eating too fast? Like, let's think about the mechanical bits first.
Yeah, I would add, am I eating while I'm stressed out? Am I eating in my car? Am I eating at midnight? Like just thinking about the circumstances surrounding digestion.
Exactly. Exactly. So the first thing we should think about is trying to create lifestyle changes. Again, as Chinese medicine practitioners, we take a tip from Sun Simiao. He's one of my Chinese medicine action heroes during the
Love
Tang
Sun Miao.
Dynasty.
Yeah.
Right? Don't you love Sun Simiao? So much wisdom there. And Sun Simiao would tell us what? He would say, change behavior first, then change diet. Then, if you need, start medicine, which obviously was herbal medicine, right? So we have to look at our behaviors first. We can't have terrible habits or counterproductive habits and then go to whatever practitioner you choose and expect the medicine or the acupuncture or the adjustment to fix the problem. If the problem is behavioral, you got to fix the behavior. If the problem starts with food, you got to fix the diet.
Lifestyle change. Why can't I
There
just take a
we go.
pill?
There
I
we go.
know, I know. It's nobody wants to hear that though. It's
Well, listen, if your muffler falls off, you don't replace your brakes. If you
really
got a
true.
flat tire, you don't put a new windshield wiper pad in. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, really true. Really true. So lifestyle comes first and then diet and then herbs. For the practitioners that are out there, is there advice that you would give to them about either using food as medicine or any sort of, obviously we use a differential diagnosis, so it's we're not prescribing herbal advice for everyone, but for actually for anyone, are there Chinese herbs that actually can help the stomach increase its production of stomach acid if we found ourselves in this situation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are some great herbal formulas that we know can help with digestion, things like Bao right? Or Jiajian, the boost the spleen formula. Obviously, they're for different patterns. But listen, it can be something as simple as eating some pickled, fermented food before a meal. Why? Because it's sour, so it will stimulate gallbladder secretion of bile, which is going to help digestion. And because it is sour and acidic, it is going to help reduce the pH of the stomach. So it is a great pre meal appetizer, if you will. You know, in China, there are boutiques for pickled vegetables. It is a real thing. In the same way, there are boutiques if you wanted to buy renshen or cordyceps. There are actually shops just dedicated to these types of adaptogenic herbs. It's incredible.
Oh, I love that. And so easy to do, right? Just a few
Oh,
forkfuls of a fermented vegetable is enough.
yeah.
And I also love just having people put a few slices of ginger in some hot water and steep it and drink it multiple times that can regulate
That's
digestion.
beautiful. That's right. Because, see, what the sour bit does is it stimulates the bile secretion and it primes the acidity of the stomach. So we can use even just something like a teaspoon or two of apple cider vinegar in water. Don't just drink it straight. You put it in 6 to 8 ounces of water, sip it over about 10 minutes before a meal, and now you've primed the pump. The other thing you can use are digestive bitters. You can go to wherever you buy your wine and buy a bottle of bitters and just put like 5 milliliters in a glass of water and drink that. I love your idea of ginger. That's not so much of a primer for digestive enzymes, but it is a prokinetic. And ginger helps to regulate the opening and closing of that lower esophageal sphincter, and it stimulates the migrating motor complex in the small intestine to sweep bacteria through it and onto the distal small intestine and the large intestine. So it also serves a wonderful purpose.
And that's really that in Chinese medicine that we have this idea that different tastes speak directly to different organ systems in the body. Like you mentioned that sour cues the gallbladder to secrete some bile. And ginger has a different taste. Ginger, it has some sweetness to it. And so it what you just described sounds like it's functioning on the motility aspect of the stomach and spleen. And so the idea of and depending on your particular imbalance as a human being, one of these things might be more important for you than another. And that's something to see your Chinese medicine practitioner about so that you can come up with a strategy so you don't have to do all the things. But if you're struggling with digestion, it's certainly not going to hurt you to experiment with adding a little bit of bitters or a little bit of ginger to your life and see how you feel.
Yeah, I think that yes, it is important to use all the five flavors because they do perform very specific functions. I will say this has been my experience and being in academia for as long as I have, I don't think there's a very good understanding at this point, unless people have really gone out and done more studies. I think our understanding is a little bit simplistic. And that is something that I am focused on going deeper into because, this idea of the flavors, yeah, it's important to understand their relationship to the organs. But more than that, it's important to understand their impact on the system. What does it do to fluid? What does it do to chi? Right? This kind of thing, because chi can be anywhere. And so we can use astringent for anything that, is not properly holding or is leaking. Anything from urogenital problems to a cough to abnormal sweating. So we don't have to limit it to the particular organ that it's associated with.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. So just to broaden this for lay people who might be curious about this, there's the notion that that not only does each taste go along with the different organ system, but it does something to the energy of the body and it sends it in a particular direction. So whether we want it to, like for example, and it'll have a particular effect, like the taste of acrid or spicy is kind of this scattering effect. It's like it's opening, it moves it out. So if you feel like you're getting sick, you eat something that's spicy that we consider that it releases to the
Yeah.
exterior versus something that is sour, which is sour and astringent can consolidate. Something like salty can soften masses, and just that these different functions pertain to the different tastes, and that we can think about what's going on in the body as a whole, and what if we're eating like one of the tastes predominantly in our diet, what effect is that having on really every system?
Yes, perfect. What really well explained. If I have a moment, can I just share with you something that I recently read that is
Please.
really fascinating?
Yeah.
Okay, so this was a wonderful study done. It was published in 2020, and it talks about the bitter taste receptors. We understand that we have non-gustatory taste receptors, meaning beside the taste buds on our tongue, our entire bodies are filled with flavor receptors. If that's news for some people, I think it's absolutely fascinating.
Totally fascinating. I'm so glad you brought this up. and I yeah, go on.
So, in this study, what they were looking at was how the bitter taste is a therapeutic target in orthopedic disorders. Now, as Chinese medicine practitioners, we understand bitter drains, it cools heat, clears heat, it reduces what we might think of as inflammation, and it goes to the bones, we're told, at least in some of the text. I want to tell you that this study showed how they used bitter melon in the study, but we could use very bitter tea, we can use bitter foods, how it triggered these G proteins to reduce inflammation in the bones and joints.
Wow, I love that. There it is in Chinese
Fabulous,
medicine
right?
for the win, and science is
Well,
bearing it out.
Yes, yes. So, it's true, right? Science is really fleshing out all these things we've understood as Chinese medicine practitioners. And so on a practical note, again, I've lived in China for quite some time, so I'm familiar with something that's used very commonly for weight loss. It's called ku ding cha. Ku means bitter. So it's ku ding cha, bitter tea, very bitter tea. So I found some organic ku ding cha. I started ordering it. I suggested some of my patients with bone or issues, orthopedic issues, start trying it. And a good number of them reported real significant difference in the pain level, the inflammatory induced pain. So this is just a practical application. Now, of course, it made them urinate more, which is why it's used as a weight loss tea, but it doesn't have to be. I mean, you could put a name on anything, right? How many times have we heard Wellbutrin is rebranded as Chantix, right? Because, oh, now we found it helps people stop smoking, but it's an antidepressant. And who knows how many other, repurposing brands they'll put on that same drug. But bitter, yes, of course, it makes you urinate more. So, yes, it helps lose weight. And we also know that adipocytes, fat cells, produce inflammatory cytokines. So they contribute to the inflammatory process. So it's all helping reduce inflammation.
I love that. I wanted to circle back to bile because you said you wanted to go there. And I know that there's increasing numbers of people having their gallbladders removed.
Mhm.
Certainly people who had kind of an underactive gallbladder because we grew up in the low fat craze of the 80s, that maybe there's some sludge and some stones that have accumulated there. Personally, I had a defunct or gallbladder that just didn't work, that was undiagnosed for about 20 years. And so I'm always interested in what I need to be doing to make sure that I am able to have enough bile to have everything work properly in my system. So let's circle back to that.
So did you so you had a cholecystectomy, right?
I did, and it was
Mm.
after 5 years of it flaring up on me. I mean, actually, the bigger story is that I would have this incredible pain that nothing would touch, and I would go and get checked out, and they would like check for H. pylori, and they'd look at my organs and they'd say like, no stones, no sludge, your pancreas is fine, your stomach's fine, you're fine, go away. And I had crappy health insurance because I was self-employed, and so that's what I dealt with for about 15 years. And then finally, after getting married and getting decent health insurance and having these attacks that were happening with increasing frequency, to the point where like I couldn't breathe or think, or like they were less intense, but they would go on for 5 days at a time, and I could like couldn't really eat or function, and it interrupted every major event of my life for 5 years, and still had to beg a surgeon to take it out because, well, after a HIDA scan where they discovered that it didn't work at all, they said, well, we could take it out and you could still continue to have pain. And at that point, I was like, no, you're taking this out as soon as I can. And I haven't had any pain since, thankfully. But I know, of course, that just because you cut off a diseased branch doesn't mean that you've treated the root in Chinese medicine,
Yeah.
and that I want to make sure that I can do what I can to, because the liver produces bile. The gallbladder, of course, is just the storage sac that releases it on command in response to help us digest. So taking bile as a supplement, but also trying to support my liver gallbladder to do it
Yeah.
itself is something that I'm interested in. But of
Yeah.
course, there's probably lots of people out there who've just noticed that they maybe have difficulty digesting fat, or they've just noticed that certainly gallbladder issues can show up as other things, as pain, as discomfort, as loose stool, as all kinds of issues with digestion. And people, a lot of times, it's less obvious than a fist under the rib cage, as it was for me.
Right, exactly. And a lot of times people whose bile is not flowing smoothly also wind up very constipated.
Yes.
Right. So, yeah, for people who are having trouble digesting, constipation, a lot of belching, maybe some distension under the ribs after eating, and yeah, flatulence and belching is a big one. I think taking some ox bile, of course, know your sources, use GMP products, right?
Yes.
That's a given. But this can be very useful. So, one of the other things that I wanted to mention about what bile does, how it functions, is that it's very important for ridding the body, in case of women especially, of estrogen metabolites, because estrogen has to be detoxed from the body, right? It happens in the liver, but how it gets out of the body depends on bile, because the bile will bind to these estrogen metabolites. Now, insufficient bile or bad flow, congestion, this can inhibit the detoxification of estrogen. The metabolites can deconjugate from the bile acid and get reabsorbed in the body. This is what people might call estrogen dominance, right? Like women who have a tendency toward fibroids or weight gain, or that PMSy feeling that just continues on, right? It may be because their gallbladder is not functioning well, or the bile is insufficient, or just too thick and sludgy and just not flowing very well. So the other thing too we have to remember is that the microbiome can influence the deconjugation, and that conversely, that the bile can act as an antimicrobial as it moves through the intestines and systems. So all of this is really important and shows us the interrelationship between the organs and the multifunction of the substances and the organs. The one other thing that I would mention about bile is that it actually, does it trigger? I'm not sure exactly of the biochemistry of this, but I can tell you that there is a component of increasing electrolytes with bile. So, and we understand that electrolytes are charged mineral compounds compounds that would trigger nerve impulses. So electrolytes, we know, are very important for our body and for our nervous system, but we don't realize that electrolytes come with bile and also are secreted by some of the other organs, like the small intestine. So, yeah, using bile acids and replacement, especially for someone who's had a cholecystectomy, I would say is a good idea.
I've definitely been taking ox bile along with other things since having my gallbladder removed, and yeah, I think it's really important. But for people who still have gallbladders and who want to take care of them, it seems like some of the advice that you gave earlier about bitters and fermented foods would certainly apply here.
Absolutely, you can start there. And in Chinese medicine and in Chinese dietary therapy, we should remember that it's very common to use organ parts and what we might consider the extraordinary organs, glandulars. This is something that's been done for thousands of years. So using jin, for example, chicken gizzards, right? This is a very common herb used when gallbladder is dysfunctional or liver is congested, which obviously will affect the gallbladder. So thinking about adding things like jin into a formula, or even for lay people wanting to expand their diet, you may not think that you want to eat or you'd like organ meat, but I will tell you this, it's got some really terrific influence on the body. One thing I can mention is liver and fatty fish also are very high in retinoic acid, which has been shown there's data to support this, reduces interleukin 6, which is an inflammatory cytokine that can actually help hijack the Tregs that decrease inflammation. So in other words, what I'm saying is when there is IL-6 in abundance, that's a pro-inflammatory cytokine. We get that from eating crappy foods, junk foods, too much animal protein, corn oils, these kinds of high inflammatory foods. When we eat those kind of foods, we are actually offsetting the relationship between anti-inflammatory and pro-inflammatory cytokines that affect our immune system. So eating organ meats, we don't realize how important some of these things are, is basically what I'm saying.
Okay.
Liver, incorporating liver into our diet can really help reduce inflammation. That's an easier way of saying it.
Okay, eat liver, reduce inflammation, and obviously that is going to have a lot of ramifications for all sorts of conditions and diseases. I know you're a little short on time, but I wanted to ask you about a particular hot button issue, and that is, should everybody be gluten-free? In functional medicine land, right? It's one of the first things that when we think about autoimmune disease, and we think about if you were to get an autoimmune disease, you're more likely to get other autoimmune diseases. And one of the standard pieces of advice for people with autoimmune disease, especially things like Hashimoto's, thyroiditis, that it's super important to be gluten-free. And yet in Chinese medicine, we don't necessarily demonize a particular food. We think everything that's natural and in a whole food form that traditionally has been eaten in a particular way can have a particular medicinal value, and that there's been studies about how eating wheat can help lower cholesterol, and anyway, that it certainly can be a healthful food if you can digest it. And yet, if you are prone to autoimmune conditions, probably a good idea to avoid it. But given the fact that autoimmune disease is on the rise, I'm curious what your take is on the gluten issue.
Yeah, so I think you really spoke nicely and contextualized it in saying, if somebody does have autoimmune condition, in particular Hashimoto's, there's clear correlation between gluten and Hashimoto's and the prevalence of celiac and Hashimoto's. So given all of that, I definitely advise patients who have Hashimoto's for sure to stop eating gluten. Yes. So for that patient population, I would advise that. Now, having said that, for other autoimmune conditions, I would probably make that recommendation. But there's a couple of things, and I'll just touch on them. One is, I agree with you, things that are natural, we don't demonize. I question how natural the gluten or the wheat is that we are now cultivating in this country in these times. So
Really good point. It's been manipulated and meant to, that even
right.
through natural means to make it so much stickier so that
Yes.
it can make all of our processed baked goods fluffy. And so that's why we like it. And most of us aren't just eating wheat in like as a wheat berry in the
Right.
fall when it's in season. But
Organic wheat berry or organic farro or something like that. Now, if it's organic farro, I would say go for it. Yeah, why not? Try it. We can, our bodies are designed to handle a bit of inflammation in the intestines. I mean, that is always happening in the intestines. We consume about 1.3 billion microorganisms a day through ingestion. So, yes, we are constantly interacting with the outside world. Having said that, it's been shown that the proteins in wheat do increase zonulin, which then does increase the opening of the tight junctions, right? So for people who are perhaps at risk of leaky gut, maybe they're on a lot of medications, maybe they've eaten a low fiber diet for a long time, maybe they don't eat fermented foods. I think I mentioned maybe they were on antibiotics. Or for these people, I would say probably reducing your gluten intake is a good idea. And for everyone, I think staying in the whole food realm is really important. I mean, and the other thing is for people who love their pasta, I would buy pasta that's imported from Italy. Why? Because they've banned GMO and glyphosate.
Yeah, exactly. And that wheat is one of those crops that sucks up the glyphosate much more than others, is my understanding of that. And for people who might be lost on the words tight junctions and leaky gut, that essentially, if you think about your intestinal lining as bricks and mortar, that basically it's like the mortar gets kicked out, and so then pieces that should be inside your intestines make their way out of the intestines and into the bloodstream, potentially kicking off your immune system to respond to what shouldn't be there. And so that is, I believe, what you're making reference to there with the
Yes.
zonulin. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
But one other thing I just want to point out, let's
Sure.
not forget that in the small intestines, right, underneath that, underneath in the lamina propria, that tissue that makes up the space below the epithelial lining, there is lymphatic drainage. There is that mesenteric lymph node. So the lymph does connect from the intestines to the rest of the body. It's not like a sealed system, and only if we, punch a hole in it, because some people might have this idea that leaky gut is somehow like punching holes, and if not for that, there'd be no crossover. But that's not exactly true either, right? That the whole idea of leaky gut is that these larger protein molecules can make it out. Like when you say, really nice image, the mortar between the bricks gets kicked out, and now bigger things can fall through. But the brick itself is still porous. So in the sense that, what happens in our intestines can certainly impact just through that microcirculation through the lymphatics.
Thanks for that clarity. I appreciate it. As we are running out of time, I would love to have you tell people how people can stay connected to you and the work that you're doing these days.
Oh, thanks for that.
Yeah, I will certainly have, don't feel like you have to like throw out a URL or anything, but I will put links in the show notes where people can find you. But if you want to give folks an instruction about what you've got going on deck.
Yeah, thanks. That's good because I don't remember the URL. Yeah, so I am currently doing some online education with TCM Hub. So if anyone who is a professional is interested in taking some courses on CEU courses on nutritional aspects, dietary therapy type of stuff, you can find me there. I am also in private practice, and so I do virtual nutritional consultation, so that you can reach me at darlene@eastonhealth.com. And if that's in the show notes, that's terrific. And I'm also in private acupuncture practice, but unless you're in Rochester, that would be a far drive.
Yes. Well, Dr. Darlene Easton, thank you so much again for being willing to share so generously of your knowledge and to give us really great practical tips about what we can be doing differently to help our microbiomes, to help our digestion, and to thereby help all of the functions of our chi and blood in the body.
Oh, it was a lot of fun, Brody. I'm appreciative that you invited me on.
Thanks for listening today. To check out the show notes, get on my email list, or drop me a line, head to brodywelch.com. That's Brody with an IE and Welch with a CH. I'd love to hear from you. If you learned something new or feel inspired to try something different in your life, I'd love for you to pay it forward by sharing this episode with a friend who you think could also benefit and give them a reason to listen. You'll be helping to create a world where we encourage each other to embody self-respect. Till next time, be good to yourself.